Do you consider yourself a space lawyer?
Well, given that the ABA doesn't recognize such a designation, um, this seems to be the old. Well, do you call yourself a doctor at a law school because you have a Juris Doctor?
Welcome to the AstroEsq podcast. I'm your host, Nathan Johnson, and in each episode, I will interview professionals in space law and policy to try and find out exactly what that means. First, a disclaimer. The views and opinions expressed on this podcast do not represent the views or opinions of any of my past, current, or future employers or clients. Okay, so this is a lawyer's podcast, so that's necessary. Today, on our first episode, I am joined by a friend of mine, someone I have known for about 5 years now, Chris Hearsey.
Hi, my name is Chris Hearsey, and I am currently the founder and CEO of the consulting firm OSA Consulting, LLC. I previously ran for Congress as a Democrat in Maryland's 6th Congressional District in 2018, and previous to that, I worked for Bigelow Aerospace, first as corporate counsel and then director of the DC office. And it's a pleasure to be here, Nathan.
Thank you, Chris. All right. So, first question. Let's see if this catches on in future episodes. Do you consider yourself a space lawyer?
Well, given that the ABA doesn't recognize such a designation, I think patents, admiralty, and a few others, you can call yourselves whatever the hell you want. But this seems to be the old. Well, do you call yourself a doctor at a law school because you have a Juris Doctor? I think what it really comes down to at the fundamental level is, what are you doing with that moniker? Are you someone that works in government? Are you a government attorney? Are you someone that works in the private sector? Are you a corporate counsel? Do you work for a private foundation? What do you do? And I think that seems to shade, in my experience, how people sort of present themselves either as a space lawyer or not. And I have found, being in this industry for over 10 years, that I look at things a little bit differently. I don't necessarily would call myself a space lawyer, but as someone who is, an advocate for developing space in a way that makes it economical and an ability to develop the solar system economically. And a part of that, to me, so I've always sort of come from it as an economist point of view. And I wrote a graduate thesis applying law and economics to public international space law. And that's always sort of been my filter. You go ask, someone maybe a telecom, they're going to consider themselves a telecom lawyer or a space lawyer. But I think space economist doesn't also ring a bell because, or doesn't ring the right bell because it's just like, it's almost kind of boring. And I know some very great space economists, and some of them also are lawyers. So, I think what's really hard about that term is it can pigeonhole you without pigeonholing you, but also doesn't describe necessarily what part of space are you a part of. And it also hides, I think, a deeper understanding of what you could expect a space lawyer to know, because it's not just domestic law in the United States, it's international law, it's laws of other countries. And it's all, it's from some people's perspective, lex specialis is somehow the special regime. But, I'm not sure I even believe that as far as we understand that term in public international law, but more of it's interdisciplinary, it's multidisciplinary. And that's the problem with space. To distinguish yourself in that way, It's interesting because other alternatives, no one's, people, some say they're environmental lawyer, and we kind of know what that is. Some people say, I'm administrative lawyer. Okay, we kind of know what that is. We have these boundaries, but space doesn't necessarily have these boundaries. In the normal concepts of public imagination, right? I mean, I think you and I both know, and everyone that would be listening that has been around space law for a long time, if you ask a layperson, what is, have you ever heard of the term space law? They're all probably going to know. And if they didn't ask you the question and you bring it up, they're going to ask you, what the hell is that? And, in some cases, I've heard even worse stories. I've heard stories to something to the degree of, well, that's just gibbery jabbery. It doesn't mean anything. And, those words are just all made up. And, there's aliens. And, then you can completely see where it can go off the rails. But I think it's important. And I think it's important to highlight, what that means and what that means to other people. So I appreciate, what you're doing with this podcast. It's really great.
Thank you for the plug
Yeah,
that I don't have to say for myself.
yeah.
Perfect.
Because it goes to the heart of our understanding of the field and how we would interact, right? A lot of aerospace in general, and also government, it's used to stovepiping ideas and processes and things like that. But by and large, generally, space is just an environment, and the fact that lawyers could show up there shouldn't be a surprise to anyone, or the fact that there are rules. Because as long as there are people, there will be problems. There will be issues that needs to be solved. And just as much as you need the entrepreneur to bring you capital, you need the lawyer to defend you. Having said that, I think that there's a wider dynamic when you talk about space law because, well, what the hell is the lawyer actually doing, right? Is he in
Right.
court? Is he defending your rights some other way? Is he doing it behind in the back room with the other attorneys negotiating the 3,000 page contracts? What exactly is space law? And I think it's important to have that perspective because again, you asked me and you're going to ask several other guests, I'm sure, over the next period of time that you're recording, what is space law? And they're probably going to give you a similar answer each time, but there's always going to be some deviation where you're just going to be like, well, I don't know. Does that fit? Does that make sense? Are we really talking about it from this perspective or that perspective? And that's the problem with space is that you could look at it very narrowly. You could look at it very broadly. And rules in which govern activities generally are written very broadly to accommodate all types of activities, but they still are found it necessary, a group of people, or in this case states, to write down some basic rules. And so space law, at least to me, means, those rules, customs, norms, laws, regulations that govern the activities of states and of individuals, whether they're corporate entities or they're natural persons. And they're all part of an ecosystem that has to operate in an environment that is completely and wholly unnatural and less than 1,000 people, maybe even less than 600 people on this planet that have ever lived have any experience of what it's like to be off the planet in that way. And even so, they didn't go very far. A group of us, or a group of them, a group of humans went to the moon, right? So, our conception of law is going to change as we venture further and further and further out. And it's interesting for me because I don't necessarily consider space as special as maybe others might. And what I mean by special is there are just some arguments I've heard that just make space as either this pristine virgin thing that can never be corrupted, or it's a place, a dumping ground for wishful thinking, wishful ideas about either humanity or what we could expect from people. And so, at the very least, I would, if you want to go name calling, I'm a bit of a realist and a pragmatist because, again, you can't argue with physics. And that's the major barrier to most of space exploration is just basic physics and overcoming the engineering obstacles to be able to have the technology to do the things that people really want to do. And we're only getting more sophisticated, and we're only going to seek to do more sophisticated things. So that's why I think it's overall natural that we go into space, and lots of different actors will go into space. But how we manage that race, so to speak, I think is will be the defining moment for space law. Are we going to expand rights, or are we going to take more rights away? Can someone can a private entity that is a national to a state that has signed the rescue and return agreement refuse to help other astronauts in distress? And will they? I think there are some people, yeah, I think that would help. But I do think there will be other people that will not. Just like we have people here on Earth that will not help. And so that's an interesting thing for law, because on one hand, you have duties of care to each other, but you also don't want to put yourself in harm's way. And so it makes it a very complicated question. But I think at the end of the day, for someone who's in a position to make the decision, it's still just going to be, well, does it make sense at the moment? Am I going to put my people at risk or not? And this is where it's going to be interesting, because these are critical moments of your rights, whatever rights you think that you have at that settlement could be gone. Could be gone. It could have already been gone in a previous agreement. You may want to change your mind. But there's a lot of aspects and a lot of dimensions to space. And I think we lose sight of the fact in space law, since a lot of things are ambiguous, and we can argue around because lawyers argue. But it does get to the issue, to the practicality of, well, who is using space law? Is it governments or private entities? And if it turns out that over time greater private entities are using space law, meaning that they are asking for resolution of disputes on their rights and obligations, then I think that's a good trend overall, as long as there are some court systems or some sort of dispute resolution mechanisms to do that. But obviously, the problem is you also want the state to recognize those things, because if they're going outside of the traditional court system, that can be a problem for the national court to incorporate those rules. But again, that's why you have to have fora like COPUOS, the UN Committee on the Peaceful Uses of Outer Space, so that their delegates could come and explain to the other people who are representing their countries, this is what we're doing. And this is exactly what happens at the State Department when it comes to at least one aspect of foreign policy, when it comes to space policy. And they have those conversations, and they will bring people from our departments of transportation and commerce and the like, and they'll go and they'll have their presentations and they'll have that conversation. And the next thing you know, a lot of people are saying, "Well, yeah, that's a good idea. Let's move along in that fashion."
You have talked about an economic background, not just to space, but to world history and human conflict. You've talked about a physics background, and you could define physics as a study of conflicts, right? Conflicts between mass and energy. I want to ask you, how did you get to this point in your life? If you could trace back, when did you start accumulating these disciplines that you now apply to your understanding of space law? And when along that path of your life did it actually become, I'm going to be a lawyer, and funnel your approach through that?
I guess, let me try to think where should, it's always interesting. Where you start the story can always determine where you end up. But um, I was never, I never planned to end up where I am today. That wasn't what I was thinking. What I was thinking when I was younger, and I think it was about when I was about 12, 13 years old, I decided I wanted to be a physicist. And as I got into high school, I decided I wanted to be an astrophysicist. And I moved along that path for some time. And when I was in high school, my junior and senior year, I believe, I was taking like AP physics and all that, but I was also doing mock trial, high school mock trial. And I remember for 2 years straight, I was for some reason I kept getting put on the defense team. But I distinctly remember, and I had some tragedy when I was younger. Um, but I distinctly remember having an interest in the law, partly because my father was a former police officer. I had cousins that were police officers. I had an uncle that was a police officer. I had a lot of family members that were in law enforcement, so it was generally around. But I always was gravitated towards science for one reason or another. I don't know if that was conscious or not, but I do distinctly remember there's a point where I felt like I had to decide, and my decision to decide unfortunately coincided with the sudden passing of my father. And so when I applied for college initially, um, I I had difficulty after the fact even remembering that I was applying, because he unfortunately died as I was applying for college, and I had completely forgotten about applying, and I ended up going to Europe for a little bit, and finding out that I got into one of the schools that I applied to, which I don't recall which schools anymore, which I applied to, but um, I was kind of flabbergasted. I was like, okay, well, I guess I should come back and start college. And so I ended up going to the University of Alaska Fairbanks to start my first semester, although technically I was a transfer student because I had community college credit. But um, I started college, I guess, officially for the first time in September of 2001. And when I was there, I was in Alaska, and all I wanted to do was do physics and play hockey. It was the only thing I wanted to do.
Did you apply physics to your play of hockey?
Probably subconsciously, yes. Yeah, elastic and inelastic collisions mostly, but um, but no, yeah. And then September 11th happened, and that really sort of changed my view about just sort of being that scatterbrained scientist, or sort of speak, I guess. Uh, and for a variety of reasons, I ended up applying to Temple University in Philadelphia, and I was excited because that program actually, in hindsight, was more targeted to what I really wanted to do at the time, and so I was surprised that I got into the mathematical physics program, which is where I started, and so I did that for a couple of years until my last semester, senior year, where I took a privatization economics course, and I did my final presentation on commercial space companies and the deregulation of space activities.
And what year was that?
That would have been the spring of 2006.
Okay, 2006. I mean, what space companies, what commercial private, I'm doing air quotes that you can't see, space companies were around then? Because I feel like maybe it hasn't changed that much, but I feel like half of the players are not there, and we have a whole new half of players here now, 12 years later.
Oh yeah, yeah. I think I think there's two, and this is anecdotally I'm saying this, but I think there's two cohorts of companies, I think, that you can categorize coming out of the 2000s, because the ones that are sort of the holdovers from the 90s during the whole we're going to do reusability, like was it Rocketdyne Keesler and a few others. But then, oddly enough, it just so happens around 2000 you had the formation of Bigelow Aerospace, technically of Blue Origin, technically of SpaceX. With all within between 1999 and 2003, Virgin was about to be born. Although that's a whole other story. No, but there's certainly been a lot of other companies that have come and gone, but there's a lot more, I think, today than there certainly were in 2006. I distinctly remember, certainly talking about SpaceX, Bigelow Aerospace, which I ended up working for. Who else was? Blue Origin wasn't wasn't really a thing. I don't think yet. I think it was still kept quiet, I think, by Bezos around that time. There wasn't much being done. But yeah, there were only a few companies, but certainly you look at the trend of things and what people were talking about then, there was a lot hopeful. And I think that since 2006 and the last, 12 years, I think we've seen a huge growth in the industry, probably a little bit bigger than I think what most would expect. But I think what we're seeing is not so much development or sort of growth of these new entities. I think there's a lot of synergies. Sorry, it's been a long day. We can turn this into a
Yeah,
meme.
it's our first T-shirt.
Yeah, synergies. Yeah, the synergies of the market, right? Because the market itself is so interdependent and heterogeneous. You can build a rocket, but what good is that if you don't have a payload? You can build a payload, but what good is that if you don't build a rocket? You got to build them in parallel, and they got to try to come together if you want to keep your costs down, which is kind of the ultimate point, since they're so expensive to manufacture in the first place. So now that we have, I think, to some degree, the settlement, I think there's foundational elements within the launch market in the United States. I think there are changing elements responding to that internationally. But the trick is not the damn rockets, but finding the companies that have the payloads, right? Find the engine, the mechanisms to get these entities, these commercial and these private entities, funding to be able to build up the different architectures that we need to address the almost infinite amount of problems in space that we have to deal with. Big companies, of course, can spend the money to do this, and they're already set up to do it. But a lot of these smaller entities can. And, I think we've all, you and I, and we know colleagues that do, a lot of startups will come and say, well, we need help, but we can't really pay you. Right? I mean, that's kind of the problem with the industry right now is there are a lot of people trained to be space lawyers to do the regulatory and other things, even though, that's not really what I think space lawyers really want to do. They just want to argue about Article 2 or some other things. But fundamentally, they're still transaction artists, right? Like we're still pushing the paperwork, we're still making sure people get things done, that the money happens, the payloads arrive on time, that if there's liability agreements that they're honored and all that kind of stuff. I mean, lawyers do so many different things, and all that is to support the ecosystem, the economy that exists in space. And you can't have that if it's just the government all the time, right? So this is why I think it's sort of a natural growth period. And I think we're getting to a growth spurt. People are on the internet doing all kinds of innovative things and not giving a damn about what any other politician says. And they're still doing it. And I applaud them. And, I want to make them work. I want to make it happen. And that's sort of the reason I got into space. And so it's interesting to me to reflect on, well, it was this our economic argument, not the scientific argument, that corralled me into the the professional I am today, who has somehow been crazy enough to get a undergraduate degree in mathematical economics and physics, political science, and 2 master's degrees and a law degree.
Yeah, so I got you a little bit off track, but you naturally brought it back around. The economic argument for space. You graduated from Temple with your degree. You finished there in a economics and law seminar.
No, so it was a privatization economics class. That's all it was. So privatizing toll roads or sorry highways, or privatizing the airlines, or deregulation, I think was the old term for it. And now it's privatization, right? I was the only one that picked this topic. And as an aside, the other reason why that was a monumental point in time for me, at least in terms of what I do today, when I gave the presentation, I got laughed at by 40 students who didn't believe such a thing existed. They couldn't believe that this would be a presentation because it couldn't, this is Star Wars, Star Trek, where you got aliens. This is not a real thing. When you're talking about aliens, aliens going to visit us. We're going to protect yourself from aliens. Like, that's kind of crap. Until the professor got pissed. He stopped the class. He says, he's like, you need to pay attention. Like, this is happening. And so for me, it's almost like double validation to not only have witnessed and seen the successes of the growth of not only the industry but of space law itself, but also to be there and to be able to shape it in the way that I never thought initially I could. But when I was at Temple, I got good advice from a mentor of mine. He told me to move to DC, and I did. And I was fortunate enough to get into American University, do a master's program in justice, law, and society. So focusing on legal theory, legal philosophy, philosophy of the law. But I got hooked up while at AU into the space industry. So the first initial work I did actually was at the National Air and Space Museum, where I did space history. And one of the things I looked at was what were the alternatives to NASA, at least in terms of the design. Everyone knew there was going to be a civilian national space program, but no one knew necessarily what it would look like. And there was a lot of movement to do it this way or that way. Scientists wanted to be of a particular way, but ended up not mattering because it all got settled more or less when it was going to be in November of 1958, with the executive board of NACA sort of saying we're going to take hold of this idea and sell it to the Eisenhower administration. So that opened my eyes to like how DC, can work, or has worked, or could work, and it certainly told me a lot about what kind of how things can fail at a policy level as well. And so coming from that history background initially was, I think, really important for my approach to space law and the aerospace industry writ large, is because I always look back at the historical references, because by and large, a lot of these ideas get recycled. People make little innovations. I mean, yeah, Elon did great with the Falcon 9, but if he didn't have, again, these processors, this would all be a pipe dream. So you merge the old and the new, and I think that's why I give Elon props. But we have to understand that this isn't something like we were given, by Moses in tablets for. This is just, we've discovered these things through trial and error, and a lot of error, and we have to recognize that error. And I think history is one of the best mediums to measure that error. But I was fortunate enough after that to ended up working in the Office of Space and Advanced Technology at the U.S. State Department. Eventually, I made my way to Bigelow Aerospace after law school. So I've seen different, I've seen the academic side, I've seen the executive branch side. Before, I didn't do space stuff, but I interned for Senator Feinstein, and so I've had experiences, I think, that most people usually don't torture themselves through, because anyone who's filled out these applications for any of these types of internships knows how brutal they are. And since I had to realize early on when I moved to DC that I was going to be a career intern, for at least for the foreseeable future, until I could find my opportunity, it works. Now, obviously, you want to find the ones that are paid, or at least the ones that give you the great perks. Luckily for me, when I was at the State Department, I got to be on U.S. delegation to Copious, among other opportunities I got from that experience. But these things are very unique experiences, and I've tried to relay those experiences to people that have asked me for advice, and what's this all about. And it's hard to come, especially to DC, into the pit of policymaking and understand what you're looking at, right? Unless you pick up a space policy textbook, you wouldn't even imagine that. Oh well, people generally view space as separated into three issue areas: commercial, civil, and military. Oh, okay. What does that mean? What is civil and what's military? What's commercial, what's not military? And space law will give you a little bit of an answer to that, and economics will give you a little bit of an answer to that, and general law, like US law, will give you an answer to that. But understanding how this all fits together in context, and understanding that it's not just about NASA, then I think that gives the right direction to a perspective about what space law is, and where it is going. And I think that's the other fundamental question, because like I said, you can come up with a million definitions, likely, and you'll have overlap on most. But where is this all going? Because if we're just going to screw this up and it's just going to be governments doing stuff, then space law is just public international law. What makes it special? Because countries are doing it in space? Like, I don't, it doesn't mean anything to me. But if we have a future where more people can participate and more people can take advantage of the benefits of space, more than just using GPS and making sure that their app is connected to the financial institution to process a payment, or to use YouTube or anything. I mean, it's more than that. And I think it first starts, and I know we have a lot of people that we know in the industry that do great work on the education side. And I think that's where it starts, getting young people educated. For me, I was lucky enough to live about a mile away from JPL growing up. And so in high school, my mom would take me to the open house. And, I would collect all the free posters, and I'd watch how many times they dipped the tennis ball into liquid nitrogen and then throw it on the floor and watch it shatter. You know, I think as someone who, I mean, I didn't grow up in means by any measure. I mean, I was in extreme poverty, but I didn't have a lot of the opportunities that most of my friends had. And so making the best of that, I think, is important. And that's why I think it's great to see NASA come up with these great educational programs. But I think more importantly is you have PBS and YouTube and all these new media for young people to absorb all this information. I mean, for me, it's the information was still the same as it was when I was 12. But if I had access to YouTube when I was 12, I mean, that's the thing. Like, we're all sitting here, anyone born after 1996 or something like that, is going to have no concept of the internet. But for us, it's like, it's imagine if we had superpowers. Yeah. What was your superpower? Absolute knowledge, instant knowledge. Okay, great. What are we going to call it? Google. Okay. Yahoo. Jeeves. Whatever. But, that's the thing. And now knowing that these resources exist, I think the trick is getting more people to be aware of it. And I think that's the next bit. And I think that's the next bit that not only the industry, I think not only is starting to address, and certainly you have things like the Brooks Owens Fellowship and the Matazakowicz, Fellowship. Young people have way more avenues into space than they ever did when I was younger, or even 15 years ago, for that matter. I think it's important for people in the industry to go to their schools, go to their junior highs, their high schools, their elementary schools, their colleges or junior colleges, and let people know that the industry exists. Let them know that space law exists if you happen to care about space law, because it's important. And if you care about rights and you care about accountability and you care about exploration and science, and you care about the future of our species, because we could just stay on this damn planet and blow ourselves up to hell if we want. But that's not what I want for my children. And I'm a little over a month being a father. Like, I want to make sure that space is accessible to everyone, and that has to start with not only the practical elements to it, but also maintaining the rights, which is where I think the law always has to fit in and make sure that your rights are protected and defined, because there are a lot of people that will take them away. And it really doesn't matter why they want to. But if you want to be able to have the freedom to go into space, we need to have that conversation now, because otherwise people with more money and more power are going to define the conversation. So, yeah, that's all I got to say about that.
Well, in terms of making sure that people and society are having the right conversation, what do you think is the biggest misconception that the general public has about space law?
Well, I think first the whole issue is just the conception of space law. Space, as an environment that's out there and rests sort of in our popular culture and science fiction and fantasy, may not be the sexiest thing to sell. I mean, when you're selling really a vacuum, but selling what NASA has to sell, right, which is exploration and science. But that's not what the law does, right? And it's not there to sell itself. It's there to be there when you need it. It's built into the foundation of your own personal activities. What recourses do you have if someone, takes away your rights? What remedies do you have? Things like that. But the general misconception, I think, is one that, again, space is special, but fundamentally that without it, it wouldn't allow you to live in today's world, and understanding that as a critical infrastructure. And I think that's what needs to be said over and over again, that space law is the legal protection of the critical infrastructure of our planet, or of the United States economy, depending on who you're talking to. It is a vital part of our industrial base. The industry produces tremendous benefits, tremendous talents. It attracts so many bright young people. There's so many things going on, but there's only so much time, so much money, and so many things to be able to do it all. And that's why I think there are opportunities, especially for young people, to look to the future and say, well, what hasn't someone done? And they don't know to ask the question if they don't know that those are their options, right? It's like the question you get asked in high school: are you going to go to college? And if so, what are you going to do? Or what are you going to do after high school? You're going to go to college? What are you going to do? How would I possibly know what to do if I don't know what my choices are? And if my entire life is limited by narrow choices, that's a travesty, because space should be inspiring. And I think that there were so many avenues to space, so many avenues to space law in particular, that you don't have to go and get 2 master's degree and a law degree to be a part of it. Sometimes that just takes, all it takes is you to send an email or shake someone's hand at a conference and ask them a question, and to think for yourself for a minute and say, well, what can I do? What would I like to do? Because unfortunately, there are a lot of young, bright people in the space industry that just don't have good mentors. And it's nice that these fellowships are coming along now, but again, they weren't there when I was there. But we have to make sure that people know that they exist. Otherwise, we become stagnant as an industry, as a profession, as a group of people who care about what happens in space, and to have the freedom to go into space. I think understanding the importance of it in your daily life is the only way to get around any sort of misconception in the general public about space law.
And along those lines, talking about, the need for the industry and the people who do know about it not stagnating, is there a misconception in the industry? Is there a stagnant idea that hasn't gone away that maybe should go away to those who should know better?
That's a loaded question.
Yeah, I know. I wanted to, you don't have to call anybody out. You don't have to name names.
I was going to ask you if I can get a lifeline. I was going to call Jack Bauer to defuse this question, but I think he'd just screw it up. Yeah, I think one thing would be, this is almost like I've been in different meetings, in different settings, where I've seen this push and pull of, well, space is hard, but we're going to do all it. And again, I worry about that type of rhetoric, because it clouds the complexity of what we're trying to do. I know it's not a great market, it's hard to market something that's complex like space, and you can break it down into its piecemeal sizes. But there's so much bad information, and we all know when we read popular this or that or whatever trade press we read, where something is sort of puffed up beyond where it should be. And I get that that's part of business and you got to sell it, and that's also part of driving people to change their minds about things, about what's possible. But at the same time, we all know that there's a certain set of ideas that are just so recycled, that are so just either impractical or bad, but we suffer through them nonetheless, and we go through them, and in private we find some way to justify them. And I'm honestly so sick of it, because really what that's telling me, it's like a symptom of a social problem with how we go about policy making, I think, to a large degree. And I don't know if there are cosmetic remedies, because I think some of the problems are so structural that you need a change in thought about how we organize for space. And if not internationally, at least within the United States.
Is there something in space development? Is there a project or is there an opportunity on the horizon that you get really excited about?
Yeah, actually, yeah. There's a few. So at least from an industry point of view, I'm very excited to see what Virgin and Blue are about to do. I do believe from looking at their testing and knowing their folks over there, that they're very close, and I think that's going to be really exciting. I think once they really start getting off the ground, certainly, and then obviously with SpaceX, the heavy lift testing, the Dragon crew testing. There's a lot of things on the horizon that I think should give everyone a sense of excitement that this is actually kind of what we've been looking for. These are the signs we're looking for.
Thank you very much, Chris, for taking the time to chat with me on the record and for being my first guest.
Oh, well, thank you for inviting me. I really appreciate it, and looking forward to a very successful Astro Esquire podcast from you.
Excellent. And you even said my name twice, so that's perfect. Thank you for listening to the Astro Esquire podcast. For more information about this episode, visit our website at astroesq.com and check out our Patreon page to subscribe for access to bonus content. If you enjoyed listening to this podcast, please leave us a review on Stitcher, Apple Podcasts, or Google Podcasts, or wherever you listen. The Astro Esquire podcast is hosted and produced by Nathan Johnson. Our theme music was composed by Kevin Bloom.